Welcome to the podcast. My name is Father Bill W. I'm an Episcopal priest, and I live here in Austin, Texas. I've had the gift of recovery since December the 27th of 1972. If you're following this series, we're doing it on a book titled, What is the Oxford Group? It's an anonymous author. If anyone knows who did write it, I'd love to hear from them. You can write me at twowayprayer@gmail.com. And it was written in 1933. Can be pretty sure Bill Wilson read this when he was coming into his own recovery. He joined the Oxford Group and stayed with it for a couple of years. Dr. Bob was also in the Oxford Group and stayed with it even longer. He was reluctant to leave it, where Wilson kind of wanted to get out early. The reason we're going through the book is to kind of go back to our origins, to see where AA came from. I often find that if we look at kind of the bedrock material out of which the steps were formulated, we're able to kind of see them in a different light, hear them in a different language, and gain some more insights into what's going on there. Sometimes you memorize the steps and, we just kind of babble them out, without a real appreciation for where they came from, how Wilson got a hold of them, and what he was trying to convey in them. In this episode, we're going to be looking at what became our steps 8 and 9, made a list of all persons we had harmed, became willing to make amends to them all. 9, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Wilson made it a two-parter because he knew this was going to be tough for us, so one is kind of get ready to do this thing, ask for the willingness to do it, and then go ahead and do it. So this chapter is on restitution. They start off with a definition, might be a good place to begin. He says, restitution is openly cutting the cord of sin, which has bound us to the life of wrong we have lived in the past. And the only way of doing this is by acknowledging our faults to the people concerned and to pay back by apology or in kind, if necessary, that which we have taken from them. We did a whole episode on the S-bomb word, sin, so don't let that one throw you. It's anything that separates us from God, anything that separates us from our true self, anything that separates us from other human beings. So it's the blockages, it's the things that get in the way and have to be removed. So restitution is openly cutting the cord of those blockages, all right, which kind of bind us to the past. And it's the only way of doing this is by acknowledging our faults to the people concerned, making direct amends, either by apology or restitution, paying back to them what we've taken. Getting ready for this episode, I reviewed much of the material that's in the big book. There's some very helpful stuff that's in the big book. I think Wilson goes into more and greater detail in that than they do here. I've had some dealings with the Oxford Group people. Some of them, when it comes to screwing up their lives, some of the things that they're feeling guilty about and some of the things that alcoholics and addicts are feeling guilty about are a different degree of magnitude, shall we say. Hey, some of their stuff is kind of light and somewhat superficial, but it's important to them. But some of our stuff is really deep and destructive. And so maybe that's the reason that Wilson pays a lot more attention to it in that section of the big book. And they treat it somewhat differently here, but I still think we can learn something from them. Let me give you this next quote, because I think this is what I wanted to get to in this episode. He says, often because we are honest and frankly acknowledge a sin to the person we have wronged by it, that person is awakened to the realization of what a changed life may mean to him or her. I don't know that we pay a great deal of attention in approaching steps 8 and 9 in light of what is the effect my sharing my wrongs with them is going to have on them. Oftentimes I hear people say, well, however they are affected by it, doesn't matter. I'm doing this for me. I've got to do it for myself. And that wasn't the attitude that they approached it with back in the earlier days. It was, I'm living a changed life. And part of my responsibility now is to help change the lives of others. And this is going to come about in part by my owning my own shortcomings, wrongs, sins, offenses that I've committed against them, and then opening up a space in their heart for them to begin doing the same. Wilson only wanted to change alcoholics, take the principles of the Oxford Group and use them for recovery purposes. But the Oxford Group itself was more interested in changing nations, changing communities, changing families, changing the world. It was more outwardly directed than I think we've made it to be. He says the absolute honesty of restitution is usually a new wonder to those who have been until then unaware of what a surrendered life can mean in a world where dishonesty is often taken for granted and truth has lost much of its meaning. I went to, I mentioned this in some previous episodes, I went to Switzerland and participated in some Oxford Group house parties, let's call them, gatherings. Corruption was a huge issue on the part of many of the people who came from all around the world. The corruption that was going on in their countries, it was phenomenal. And they wanted to bring back to their countries an appreciation for the power of honesty and the effect that could have on their country. Because if they weren't able to overcome that, if truth has lost all of its power, and I think there's a lot of that going on in this country right now, it's a main issue that we have got to address. And certainly it's one that alcoholics and addicts, because of the radical honesty, absolute honesty in the Oxford Group language, that we need to start living on the basis of that. And that somehow we meet God through that. The challenges that we face in terms of the world that we're living in, they're pretty far away from that. So it's important, that we appreciate the importance of this concept. Also important how we approach it, because they're going to make some comments on that. He says, as these people, as they listen to this changed life, which suddenly confronts them, these strangers to restitution often do not understand the feelings they experience. Yes, the world, they are quite certain, is becoming very mad, or perhaps very, very sane. When we approach a person in this state of trying to take responsibility for our lives, it's going to have an effect on them. What he says here, as they listen to this, they're going to say, well, is this guy crazy? Or has he found some sanity in his life? It's kind of a revolutionary way of approaching this thing. It really is the sane way to do it. But it comes at a cost to ourselves. He says, whatever the occasion of the restitution, it is not just an empty, dramatic gesture with no true or constructive significance. It is an indispensable condition for the birth of a new spiritual life. Big Book says we were reborn, and it's getting at what are the conditions necessary to begin living a new life. And it's a new life based on what? Being honest, pure, unselfish, loving, all the four absolutes that we're going to get into a little bit later. What constitutes a spiritual life? And they make a point in here. You can say the words, or you can be a living demonstration of it. And that's the important thing. The Big Book says the same thing. People have heard this, I'm sorry, a 1,000 times from us. They're not looking for that. They're looking for a changed life. and they're going to be suspicious, and it's going to maybe take them some time to watch and see, is that really what is happening to us, or is it just another con? So at this point in the chapter, he goes into the story of Frank Bookman, and I think it's an important story to understand because many of the 12 steps came from the life and experiences of Frank Bookman, and 8 and 9 are a classic example of this. So to get an appreciation of what happened to him, you can, I think, gain a better understanding of what it is that's supposed to happen to us. Bookman was a Lutheran minister. He got a job running a kind of a group home, let's call it, for young men in the Philadelphia area. During the course of his management there, he had an altercation with the board of directors. And there was 6 guys on the board. And one night they came to him and at a meeting, they said, "Frank, you're spending too much money feeding these guys. We want you to cut down on the food bill." He has a big ego, and he has an argument with these fellows, and he quits his job in a moment of rage, let's say, righteous indignation. He thought he was right, but he built up a wall of separation between himself and those 6 guys. So he leaves the job, he's on a tour of Europe that he was scheduled to take. So he goes ahead and does that. And as he goes, he feels this separation. That's the important thing. He feels that there's a blockage between him and these guys. And to the degree that there's a blockage between himself and them, there is equally a blockage between himself and God, almost like a mathematical formula. So he says, resentment against certain of the trustees festered in his heart. For some time, he had an uneasy feeling that this was causing the trouble. Always pride had forbidden humiliation before these men against whom he felt he had a just grievance. Then he goes on, while visiting in the English Lake District, and still in this state of mind, he wandered one day into a little country church where a woman was speaking on some aspect of the cross. Something in what she said stirred him to the depths, and he saw himself for what he truly was. It was the turning point. You never know what is going to register change in a person. It can be some of the strangest things. Bookman later said, she didn't say anything that I hadn't heard before. Nothing new. But for some reason, at this moment in his life, there was an openness in his heart that allowed her message to get through. And it changed him. He saw his part in the argument that he had with those 6 guys on the board. He later said, I was the 7th wrong man. And he could see his part in the argument, Next day, he mailed to America 6 letters of simple apology. And at the head of each, he wrote, and these are the words from an old hymn. And I'm going to put a link to the hymn in the show notes. It's worthwhile to listen to it. I think the version I've got in there will have the lyrics as well. It's important to kind of see them. And this is a 100-year-old hymn or more. Don't get too caught up with the language. Get down to the essence of it, okay? Because that's what's important. So the hymn says, when I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, Jesus, my richest gain I count but lost, and pour contempt on all my pride. When he wrote his letter of amends to these 6 guys on the board, that is what he wrote at the top of each page. He wrote the words of that hymn so that they would have the spirit in which he's coming at this thing. And then he wrote, that he was apologizing for his hardness of heart, if you will. Hey, says he never heard from those 6 men, but for the first time in a year, he felt the power of Christ returning as an inward reality. What did he do? He removed the blockage that was getting in the way of his relationship with these 6 guys, and it was impacting him. And when he removed that blockage, he was able to feel God's love and God's presence, God's reality returning to him. And I've heard this over and over again. Well, from my own experience, and then from the experience of hundreds of people who have taken steps 8 and 9 and reported back what they felt, that the blockages between them and other people, the blockages between them and God, and just as importantly, the blockages between themselves and this new birth, this new self that was being created in them. That blockage was being removed, okay? And it's pride. It's always, well, not always, but it's 9 out of 10 times pride that is getting in the way, and that has to be removed. This is where I think Wilson does an even better job of dealing with the complications, the conditions around making an amends. Because Wilson had some pretty serious ones, and like I said, many of us alcoholics and addicts, we got some pretty serious ones with serious consequences, and we need to be cautious in approaching them. What if my restitution towards a certain person does more harm than good? And this is the piece that I want you to kind of take hold of. He says, into this problem, there enters the important solution of God guidance. Because this is the thing that I think we've lost from our 12-step approach these days. The whole thing of how God guides our lives. He says, if we remember that surrendered lives are in truth God-directed lives, prayer can then help us where we cannot help ourselves. Spiritual direction is often the better part of mental valor when we contemplate making restitution. It is of no profit to God or man for us to wreck innocent lives by indiscretions prompted by our over-zeal. The Holy Spirit is absolute discretion. God-given guidance should prompt all our acts of restitution, telling us what atonement constitutes, the right time to make it, the form it should take, and giving, if we need it, the spiritual strength to carry it out for the best of all parties concerned. We've got some difficult decisions to make. In our 4th step, we listed all of the people that we had harmed, and approaching step 8, if we missed any, we'll add them to the list. But now, what do I do with it? And this is where you don't wait till you get to the 11th step to figure this out. This is where the whole essence of the Oxford Group program and the early AA pioneer approach to it was living a God-guided life and doing two-way prayer and bringing these problems and issues to my prayer and seeing what the guidance was that I received. And if I'm having a hard time with that, I certainly take that to a person who's also living a God-guided life and run it by them and see what it is that they have to say. So let me go through those points again, because I think they're really important. Telling us what atonement constitutes. So what should we do? God, I've got this issue in my life. I've got this unresolved debt that I've got, this troubled relationship that I've got with so-and-so or my family member, my kids, whatever it might be. When is the right time to make it? What form should it take? Can you give me the spiritual strength to go about and do it? All right. I mean, that's the stuff that real prayer is made up of. Not this pious God in the sky kind of stuff. It's the living situations that we all face, where we need guidance and we need help and we need direction, and we certainly need strength to carry it out. He shares the parable of the prodigal son. I'm sure most of you know the story, but he gives it here in a little bit of depth. So the story is that this kid has a fight with his old man, and he says, I want my inheritance now, which is as good in this. What it means in the story is telling the old man to just drop dead. Give me the money now. And then what does he do? He goes to the crack house and he blows it. And then he's living with the pigs. The important part, I guess, is that when in the story, it doesn't reference it here, but he says the kid comes to his senses. He gets restored to sanity. He comes into his right mind. This is where he picks it up. He says, I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm not worthy to be called your son. Make me one of your hired servants. And he got up and he came to his father. But while he was still far off, it's a beautiful part of the story of the prodigal son. It's not really a good title for the story. It's really about the nature of the father. So while the kid was far off, his father saw him, and he was moved with compassion. And he ran. Kid didn't run to meet the father. The father runs out to meet the kid, falls on his neck, and kisses him. I mean, you need to feel that. I mean, that's what we're shooting for in this spiritual solution. I mean, we're feeling guilt and shame and remorse and all of this terrible stuff. And waiting there for us is the embrace of the God who is within each and every one of us. And then the kid says, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm not worthy to be called your son. I often wonder when I read that, if the kid wasn't just practicing some lines, maybe another con was in him. I'm just going to say this, and then I get 3 hots and a cot. But again, it's not the kid's, not his attitude that's so important. It's that of the father. And the father says to his servants, quickly, get the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his finger, shoes on his feet, bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let us eat, make merry. And this is the important line. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now is found. Was lost and is found. Was dead and he's alive. That blockage that was getting in the way of his relationship with me and my relationship with him is gone. And now the love is flowing. The joy is present. It's new life. It's new life. And that's what recovery is genuinely all about. Am I willing to pay the price that it may take to get myself into that new relationship? Kind of maybe a warning here at the last paragraph. It says, we must not expect all our acts of restitution to be received with acclamations of joy, as if we are all prodigal sons returning home, and should therefore receive the modern equivalent of a fatted calf. Our atonement may perhaps mean payment that will be a trial to us, or it may be flatly ignored, as were Frank Bookman's 6 letters. But if we make our restitution in the right spirit, it is certain that we shall know the power of God as an inward reality. Great reality is within. Real recovery is getting ourselves in touch with that reality, allowing ourselves to feel the power of that reality in our lives. Tough instances that we're going to have to face, tough decisions that we're going to have to make, decisions of timing, decisions that involve other people. When I did my 4th step with a guy, shared it in the 5th, and then when it came time for making amends, part of my problem had been I'd left a lot of broken relationships behind me. And I wanted to then go and make amends to those people that I had run out on, let's say. And the guy said to me, Bill, you don't have any right to reinsert yourself in their lives. They have moved on. They have forgotten you. You may want to feel good by reinserting yourself into their lives, you know? And I'm talking here about old girlfriends or kids that I had worked with in an orphanage thing, you know. What they wanted from me was a relationship with me. And I wouldn't give it to them. So I left, just kind of repeated that pattern. And what people are looking for is for somebody who will stay, somebody who will open themselves up to them. You know, I'll never forget when I had my first fight with my wife, who's still with me after all these years. My instinct was to leave. We had a fight. I'm going to leave. And she said, no, you have to stay. You have to stay and fight it out. And that's what relationships are about. For me, it was to run and to drink and to drug and to cut it off. And yet to stay and to stay with it is sometimes the much harder part. And yet it's the much more human part. I can't tell you how many people I've worked with who made amends to their children who were deeply, deeply hurt by their alcoholism, by their abandonment of the family, those kinds of things. You know, that wasn't my experience, and I'm grateful for that. But it was theirs. And they, in many cases, took years of the kids testing them, not wanting to get hurt again, but they stayed with it. They stayed with it. And in time, the kids were not looking for the nice words, the sweet apologies. They were looking for a change of behavior. And that's the thing that these steps, these 8 and 9, are so important. They bring a reality to our lives. We can say the words, but this is where we've got to show that we mean it. So get your guidance. Don't just run out and make an amend. Pray about it. Talk it over with a sponsor. Talk it over with someone who's also doing two-way prayer. See what your guidance is. And then if it is to proceed, if it is to go and make that amend, ask, how do I do it? Ask, when do I do it? And above all, ask for the strength to do it. So pretty good material here on the restitution piece. In the next episode, we're going to look at the guidance in a little more depth, and then we'll start tackling the 4 absolutes and put a bow on this book and move on to something else. So hope this was helpful. If it was, tell a friend about it. Thank you for listening. God bless, and keep coming back.